Charles Hamilton Houston, a lawyer, teacher, and mentor, used strategic communication to lay the groundwork to destroy the legal precedent of segregation. His blueprint propelled his former student, Thurgood Marshall, in front of the Supreme Court to argue the case of Brown versus Board, a case that decided the fate of segregation across America. Charles Hamilton Houston was born on September 3, 1895. Less than a year later, the Supreme Court would make a decision that Houston would dedicate his life to fighting. This case, known as Plessy versus Ferguson, left a legal stain on the American courts, and this stain would be challenging to remove. This is because the American legal system runs under the idea of precedence. When a court makes a decision, it doesn't just look to the text of the laws. It looks to how other judges made decisions in the past. To some degree, court decisions themselves can become pseudo-law. In 1896, the legal precedent that ruled over civil rights was the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. This case made segregation completely legal on the condition that theoretically equal facilities were provided for each race. This separate but equal doctrine ruled over every aspect of Black Americans' lives, and Houston was acutely aware of how this doctrine worked and failed to work. For most of Houston's young life, he lived sheltered from the burden of racism. His parents had significant amounts of money and were able to keep him in a more secluded neighborhood around D.C. with other, more wealthy Black families. He was woken to the real toll of segregation when he decided to fight in World War I. He volunteered to become an officer and went to the newly created training camp in Iowa, dedicated to training Black officers. Even though Houston and the other future officers volunteered to fight for the U.S., it was clear they were seen as second-class citizens. The trainers at the camp, under direction from the Department of Defense, explicitly skipped over training like artillery training and engineering training because they claimed the African Americans were not educated enough to handle it. When Houston and the others finally finished their training, the Department of Defense assigned them to spots they were wildly untrained for, and this move put Black soldiers' lives at serious risk. Houston's struggle did not get any better when he made it to the European theater. There, Black officers were forced out of the mess hall designated for officers and left to eat outside of the kitchen. Black officers were threatened with lynching by other white officers. And this toxic ooze of racism, both systemic and personal, hardened Houston, and he knew he needed to destroy this legal precedent that supported racism. When Houston got back from the war, he enrolled in Harvard Law School, getting his law degree and JD. Houston was now armed with the tools to fight segregation. He just needed an army. And Houston was offered the opportunity to help build one at Howard Law School. The first Black president of Howard Law hired Houston to be the dean. At the time, Howard Law School was one of the best schools for future Black lawyers, but it was nowhere near as good as competing schools for white people. When Houston arrived at Howard, he hit the ground running. Houston began by firing professors who were complacent, or he pressured them to resign. And after raising the staff, he was able to hire extremely qualified Black professors who were barred from working at other schools only on the basis of race. Houston also raised the standard for students admitted into Howard Law. He had stopped allowing students from unaccredited colleges to enroll in the law school. Houston seized the full role of dean, and by overseeing all the classes, Houston was able to both hold teachers and students to a higher standard, and was able to remove inefficiencies from the curriculum, like cutting classes which concepts could be better covered than others. Houston also made reforms that communicated this higher standard he was looking for. Houston made certain professors forced the students to follow every little rule, like much stronger enforcement of tardiness. He also communicated this standard in more subtle ways. For example, he told his staff they should be doing some of their work in the library as a show of camaraderie with the students. Houston's harshness wasn't without reason. Houston held his students and staff to this high standard because this is the same high standard that the courts will hold these African American lawyers to because of their race. Judges would be looking for any chance to discount them, and Houston would not allow any of his students to make those mistakes. Houston knew any mistake in the legal fight for civil rights could set the process back years due to the precedent set. Doctors can bury their mistakes, Houston joked, lawyers cannot. Houston's reforms earned the school full accreditation from the American Bar Association, and this vindicated some of the more aggressive choices Houston had to make. But this did not stop Houston's drive to continue improving the law school. He made curriculum changes to emphasize one major theme running through a student's whole education: becoming social engineers. Houston's so-called social engineers were designed to help fight in the courts for things like civil rights or the destruction of segregation. Houston's creation of these social engineers had 3 critical steps. Step 1. Learn the law. This was done by reading books, knowing all the case law and all the precedents. Step 2 was learning to think like a lawyer, thinking both critically and strategically about the cases. And then step 3 was teaching students to be able to use the law to change the law. Houston wanted them to both understand the weight that precedent had on all court cases, but also how precedent can be shaped by a clever enough lawyer. Houston used strategic communication to build a team of lawyers at Howard who would communicate the rigor of their preparation and their demeanor and arguments. He taught the lawyers a plan for speaking to judges and juries about the racist policies in ways they would understand and that would be difficult to refute. Not all of the teaching Houston gave came in the classroom. From Howard's privileged location in Washington, D.C., Houston was able to take the students to the U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI headquarters, and various courtrooms to remind the students that these cases they were reading about in books were happening in the real world. For some students, like Thurgood Marshall, Houston was able to take the real-world teaching a step further. When the NAACP wanted Houston to defend a client in a murder trial, he brought students Thurgood Marshall and Edward Lovett to help prepare and try that case, and demonstrate the art of being a social engineer as a lawyer. The case was a murder trial for George Crawford, a black man. Houston and the NAACP didn't just join the case to try to save Crawford from death row, which they eventually did. They were also aiming for something bigger: jury reform. Houston argued that the jury in the Crawford case was specifically only made up of white people. In fact, in the state of Virginia, there had never been a jury that African Americans had served on, and only 1 or 2 African Americans were ever even put into the jury pool, even though they were more than qualified to serve. The case resulted in a huge victory for the NAACP. After this trial, the counties of Virginia began to include more black people into their jury pools. This personal experience was able to show Thurgood how you could masterfully be a social engineer to be able to both protect your client and protect the rights of many other future clients. Even after graduating from Howard, Marshall continued to learn and collaborate with Houston. Marshall's first big case at a law school would be the precursor to the case that would define Marshall's career. Working for the NAACP, he argued the case of Murray v. Pearson, and in it, Marshall and Houston's convincing arguments against school segregation helped let a black student be admitted into the white Maryland Law School. Houston, Marshall, and the NAACP would continue to fight the separate but equal doctrine by focusing on education. Houston reasoned that it was impossible for states to provide 2 segregated schools of equal quality, and as such, he could force them into desegregation just because of the costs. Eventually, they would argue that it's impossible for schools to ever be separate but equal. Just the act of separating builds inequality and prejudice. Over time, Houston rose up in the NAACP, eventually forming the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And leading it, he worked with Houston to pick away at the precedent of Plessy until April 2, 1950, when Houston died of a sudden heart attack. Houston's fight against Plessy lived on in Thurgood Marshall and the lawyers of the NAACP, as they used the strategy of slowly chipping away at Plessy through the educational system. Thurgood Marshall was able to use the skills and blueprint laid out by Houston to argue in front of the Supreme Court the case of Brown v. Board. Thurgood's victory in that case completed Houston's crusade to destroy the precedent of Plessy, showing that there is no way that separate but equal could ever truly be equal. Charles Houston's teaching style, focusing on producing lawyers to fight for the rights of African Americans, was a grand success. Houston's plan of teaching to fight through the legal process was fulfilled by his student Thurgood Marshall when they defeated the racist legal doctrine of Plessy.